And after watching that and realizing we're talking about data again today, as we did yesterday, we're looking to find out exactly how all that information is shared. So looking forward to this chat this morning. Brad, sitting next to me here, is a veteran data engineer, having designed, built, and deployed multiple bleeding-edge and open-source solutions and technologies at Standard Bank. And Marianne, it's good to be able to connect with you as well, Chief Data and Analytics Officer at FNB ConnectMe. Let's start with you this morning, Marianne, talking here about data and the way that it's currently reshaping business decisions and banks. Do you want to share some key examples with us of the impact that that's having in terms of strategy?
Good morning, and thank you, Brad. And from the previous panel, what a great discussions that we're having. I think the one thing that we can all attest to is that data in the new era, like we've been talking about data, but I think we're increasingly seeing that that's the one thing that is becoming constant in terms of its need. We moved away from where we were making decisions from a gut feel, but now we actually want proper data points that actually influence how we make decisions as corporates. So what we are seeing from a data perspective is that from a strategic perspective is we want those insights so that we know exactly what is happening with our customers, with our operation. From a risk management perspective as well, is it's important for us to understand using data how we can manage those things. I think we can all attest that there's a lot of risk, a lot of fraudulent activity that is actually happening, and with all of these spams and scams that are happening, we always have to be ahead of the curve in terms of how we actually mitigate or somehow use data to inform how are we going to use the next steps. So I think strategically, like from a strategic perspective, is that those are some of the things that we are seeing, and it takes us making sure that we use the data that we have, well, also with externals, just to make sure that we are always ahead of the curve in terms of how we actually service our customers.
Can I bring you in here, Brad, as well? I mean, you're somebody who's collecting that data. You're building all of the systems that are collecting it. Tell us a little bit about that from the backside of things in terms of how that's being used strategically in business.
Sure thing. So I think there's two processes that we'll talk about. One is the storaging or the collection and storage of the data, and the other is the processing of that information. So I think critically when it comes to storage of information, the ingestion of that information and thereafter the storage, it hasn't changed over the years. Batch processes still exist, although what we are seeing is more a tendency towards increasing the velocity of how data is generated and consumed. So real-time event engineering, event processing, that's becoming more and more important and critical, especially to enable the conversations as spoken. Of importance, though, is storing that information, making sure that you store it securely, making sure that it's accessible to the right people. You spoke about, potentially the fraudulent transactions that might happen, the conversations around, the risk of storing your data. Those become pivotal to how we, ensure that we mitigate potential issues. So, one of the core conversations at the moment is around ransomware. So by collecting information and making it accessible, you also run the risk of making it accessible to the wrong people who have access to that information that shouldn't. And we've seen that a lot in the industry recently. So just keeping in, consideration how we store the data, where it's stored, the accessibility. We spoke about governance. Your metadata and lineage become key components to that. Outside of that, though, there's also the processing of data. So one thing to bear in mind is that, as part of the generative AI boom that we're seeing, there has been a lot of conversations around what data scientists have access to and how that data is used. Processing data is very expensive, especially as we move towards cloud-based technologies and the hyperscalers. It does become quite pivotal to manage costs. So one of the ways that you can potentially do that is by duplicating your data at a storage layer, and that becomes, part of the storage conversation. But at the same time, if you have too many duplicates of data, you have to ensure that you have the proper governance around metadata and lineage, and then what risks do those impose. So those also become part of the conversation, and data stewardship and data management and data governance are critical conversations around storage of data as well as the processing of data.
I'll stay with you for a moment longer, Brad. What are the most effective methods for banks to be able to collect and then consolidate and then utilize that data?
Sure. So from a collection perspective, obviously we spoke about, batch processes. So you've got your traditional, ETL and ELT process, extract, transform, load. But on top of that, we're starting to see an explosive growth in velocity. So how do you utilize things like change data capture in order to collect data? How do you use things like APIs and event-driven engineering to collect data? So those start to play pivotal roles in the collection of data. And again, it depends where your data is sourced from. That also becomes pivotal to the conversation. So, are you web scraping, which has arguably various ethics impacts, but at the same time, the ethical collection of data is important, and maintaining that collection of data, and then the utilization of that data. Do you have the consent to use that data for its purpose? Yeah.
Marianne, let's continue that. What are some of the challenges that are faced in trying to collect and utilize and process this data information?
I think it all goes back to what is it that we're also trying to solve, right? And understanding what that business use case is, I think that's where you start seeing all those different challenges, because is the data available in order for us to be able to use it? I think that's where you start seeing that come through. But I think also, so fundamentally is what is that business use case that you're trying to solve? But also some of the challenges is that from a domain knowledge perspective, I think everybody assumes that we can just use the data. However, it's very important. We've got subject matter experts in the businesses that understand exactly what is it that they're actually solving. And it becomes important that as data specialists, we sit very closely with the business people to understand what is the problem that we need to solve, because it's not just data outside it, but it's data in conjunction with understanding what the problem is and being very close to that relationship. You can actually accelerate some of these things because it's not in isolation in terms of how we solve it.
Yesterday we were chatting around hyper-personalization. I want to bring personalization back in here. Do you feel banks are fully leveraging customer insights into the space of personalization?
I think we're making progress when it comes to it. Well, there's still a lot of work that can be done, as it could be said, but I think we're making a lot of progress. I was actually thinking about it as they were having the conversation yesterday. As I'm sitting here, I'm actually a customer to the bank, although I work for them, right? And how am I experiencing it at this point as the customer? And that's why I know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And how then, because I also experience it as a customer, how do I make sure that those experiences filter down so that these personalization can actually make sense? But I can't do it in isolation. And when we talk about customer personalization, it's exactly what you guys then do. There's a lot of data sources that actually have to form part of this personalization. What is the framework that you're actually going to build in order for this to be a customer-centric approach in terms of what are those data sets that we need to actually pull from the different places, put it in such a structured way that then we can start actually making sure that we're using it for personalization purposes. And what I always say is personalization also goes we always need to look at it from a customer-centric approach. Personalization is not the fact that you called me by my name, Yes, it's great that you did. It's great that you're recommending all of these things. But are you also listening to me? And that was such a great example. Are you actually listening to me as your customers? I'm giving you proper feedback in terms of what I also prefer. My preference in terms of which channel I actually want to use. Are you actually looking at that? My language preferences, if I tell you once, are you taking it into consideration the next time that you engage with me as your customer? So it's such things that we actually need to look at. And if you think about it, this is like the basics in terms of our data collection. As always, we want to know these basics. Yes, we talk about all the fancy stuff, but are we also just generally looking at the assets that we have from a data perspective and sweating those just to make sure that we still understand how the customer actually need, or what they need from us. And when we talk about hyper-personalization as well, the other thing that I always look at it from a customer-centric perspective is, and customer experiences, we also need to look at this from an employee experience perspective as well, right? How are we making sure that those two worlds are interlinked? Because at the end of the day, there's still somebody that needs to sit in this conversation assisting the customer. And how do you enable both parties in order for this experience to be effective.
Thanks, Marianne. Brad, what are some of the strategies that can improve personalization?
Sure. So I think, that's a broad question. There's a ton of ways to enable personalization for a customer. Behavioral banking obviously being one of them, and it's becoming a lot more relevant in today's day and age. But I think, there's an expectation from a customer around personalization to begin with. You've had your Netflixes, your Googles, your Amazons who have all been doing personalization now for 10 plus years. And when you log into a site, they give you a personalized response, and this is what the expectation is around what personalized content and or personalized content-driven strategies are. But what do we do to enable that? So there's a couple of aspects, and I'm sure they vary per bank. I won't go into the specifics. But obviously, artificial intelligence has come a long way, especially with the advent of generative AI. So you've got your traditional artificial intelligence technologies like OCR and image recognition, those capabilities. Now you're starting to talk about personalization and behavioral banking, but what actually enables it? So you're looking at technologies like, for example, digital twinning is helping us to define simulations for what our personalized banking behaviors could be. So for those who don't know, digital twinning is essentially creating a carbon copy of an entity. In this case, it could be a customer profile, and then, creating variables that could affect that customer. And in doing so, you can simulate behaviors and you can simulate impacts around it. It's a science that's been utilized a lot in industries like engineering, and we're starting to see that in banking at the moment. And then other things is, I think everybody's sick of this term, but 360 degree of a customer, that's another big one. So single view of customer, 360 degree of customer is understanding, what your customer sort of needs are, what their wants are, what products they have with you, what products you could potentially, on-sell or cross-sell. Those become conversations around 360 degree view of customer. But at the same time, being very cognizant of, what we can and can't do with customer information. It is a critical conversation point. There's obviously, the laws around GDPR or POPIA that come into effect, but at the same time, there's the ethics. I think you made the very good points of we are also customers at Standard Bank or at Absa or at FNB or whatever the case may be. And, we're also very aware of the fact of how our information is being used by the companies that we also work for.
Yeah.
And so those are also very good conversation points because, yes, there are loopholes in the law that you can get around to do stuff that you might want to, but, there's always that governance and that oversight of, okay, cool, just because we can have a 360-degree view of our customer, should we, and to what extent? And how invasive do you want to be versus how pervasive do you want to be? Those also start to play a role in the conversation.
Marianne, we heard a conversation around AI. I want to touch on that very briefly, but more of advanced analytics and how do those come together to spur on new growth opportunities in the banking sector?
And I think I like that conversation because I think critically the one thing that was mentioned in terms of so in terms of new trends that we are seeing in terms of understanding emerging markets when it comes to it, and how do we actually take hold of the new insights that is coming from the data itself, right? And what I like about it, though, is that from a data perspective, if you don't get that layer of making sure that your data is in a good quality state, right, it becomes such a difficult conversation because we need to make sure that at any given time, when we are talking about these things, our data is at a good quality. And you spoke about data management and governance when it comes to it. So I think it's quite important for us to make sure that we are bedding down those concepts and making sure that we are prioritizing it and making sure that our data is at a good state. In terms of the stuff that we're actually seeing, as if you look at the bank itself from a fraud detection perspective as well, that's where I'm seeing a lot of traction when it comes to it because we're building out models to make sure that we can monitor those kind of activities and making sure that we're monitoring it. And we are more proactive in terms of our approach rather than reactive. And that's just monitoring some of the transactions from a transactional perspective. From an operational perspective as well, there's a lot of unlock from efficiencies that we are seeing there, that we are using it. From a training perspective as well, is how do we start leveraging it? Because some of these things are very repetitive in nature, as how do you start leveraging those kind of capabilities to enable it? But also within the data and community perspective, I'm sure all devs can attest, documentation is one of the worst nightmares that you can ever have to do. And we've gotten to a point where we're leveraging some of these things to enable us, so that we can be more efficient in looking at the data and the insights and coming up with new stuff to use rather than well, I don't want to say waste. It's important for us to do the documentation, but what we're also seeing is like stuff like code assist that also does exist at this point. And it's in collaboration. You cannot just take the code. It's in collaboration but it's assisting in terms of how we are also being efficient and how we're working.
I think just to add to the conversation, I mean, there's always the front-facing, sexy use cases around business and AI enablement, but you spoke very much about the back-end operational use cases around artificial intelligence and how they can be utilized with things like, for example, site reliability engineering as top of mind.
Yeah.
And it is becoming very much a relevant conversation around how do we not only use generative AI and machine learning to enable customers, but also to enable our own systems and capabilities so that they can be more operationally efficient and effective. So that is a very good point. And then the other one is garbage in, garbage out, right? So you spoke about, that data layer being extremely pivotal, and that's true. If you have garbage data and you use that to train a model, your model is going to be garbage. And that's true for pretty much any analytics use case, whether it's operational or business-facing analytical. So good thanks.
Yeah, and I think just on that, because it's a spot on, but also when we talk about from an AI perspective, we're all looking at banker assists and chatbots and all. There's just a lot of training that also goes into these components, right? Just so that, because you still don't want to make the customer frustrated at the end of it. And all of those technologies are there. However, there's still a lot of work that we still need to do to just ensure that from a customer experience that is seamless.
Brad, let's talk innovation. What are some of the innovations that you're observing that are data-driven?
Sure. So I think obviously top of mind is generative AI. Large language models are very pervasive in this industry at the moment, or any industry. They're household conversations now, right? So everybody's looking at generative AI as one of the innovation capabilities. And that can be applied in a multitude of contexts. You're looking at, for example, chatbots, I think is one of top of mind for everyone, whether that be through a digital channel or through your branches. How can you potentially use generative AIs to have the same seamless, continuous conversation with a customer as part of an engagement, regardless of which channel they choose to engage on. So that's one place. The other places where we're starting to see innovation is, again, in the back-end operational systems. So code generation as well as documentation generation. Those are becoming pivotal to how we enable our up-and-coming engineers through codifying prompts and prompt engineering, which is becoming a really relevant term nowadays. But also outside of that, I think one of the things, and we spoke about social responsibility in the earlier talks, is these conversations are driving a lot of conversations with different universities and what the expectation is from an outcome when people go and get their degrees, especially when it comes to AI-driven courses. So there's a lot of conversations happening there around the innovation that's enabling not just the banking industry as a whole, but the continent of Africa and all of the relevant and associated colleges and universities where you can potentially obtain your degree. So those are, additional contributors to innovation within the space that aren't necessarily seen as a customer, for example.
So if I can just add on that, because you are spot on in terms of some of the stuff that we're also seeing. If you look at getting data as well from different aspects is what we are also seeing is that there's this need of when a customer chats to us and it's a voice is how do we convert that? That's still using that technology, converting that voice into text and then using natural language processing just so that we can then further unpack in terms of what is it that the customer is saying within our context. There's a lot of text as well, and if there's chats that is happening, as how do we take that data, apply natural language processing to understand sentiments, if there's opportunities to upsell and cross-sell, but that's also just another medium in terms of how we can get more insights using the data that is around us, and that will also include third parties, social media, just analyzing all of that data holistically for us to understand or have a better perspective.
Yeah, and I think a big thing is like the ecosystem, right? So a lot of the times, you know, and it speaks to your point around collecting that data and a holistic view of that data, you create these ecosystems of products that can potentially be utilized. So a good example is I go and I buy a home loan, or I go and I request a home loan. And, you know, we can say, okay, cool, this home has like, you know, 2 garages. Are you interested in potentially purchasing, you know, for example, a car? And then you start to on-sell services like that. But again, within the respecting a customer's intentions and also ensuring that, you know, you understand what the customer's needs are. You know, we've seen it with things like, for example, solar panels. It's been very pervasive to the industry. But yeah, so those types of conversations around building out an ecosystem to enable a customer to give them the best experience possible is critical to these innovation conversations.
We can't talk about data without talking about governance and privacy compliance. Can you talk around that for us, Marianne, as we look at the importance of taking care of this data and know that somebody's watching over it and that the processes?
Yeah, sure. And I know we all call it data governance, but I like to change it up because when people hear data governance, I think one of my colleagues once said is everybody thinks it's the police. You don't need the police up until you actually need them, right? So I think in my experiences, I've always changed this term within the area, not call it data governance, but data enablement. Because when you have the conversation with business, now they don't take it as, oh my goodness, this is this big scary thing, and then they're here to police what we're doing. However, as we say, enablement is we're working together just to make sure that this data construct is not something that somebody, like it's not a one-man thing. It's we all have to collectively work together to get this construct correct. From a data like it's actually a critical point in terms of how we get any of these, from an analytical perspective, from an AI perspective, to your point, garbage in, garbage out. But it's how do we make sure that we center all the stuff that we're doing from a data perspective using that enablement? Who are the key people that own this data, you know? Who's then responsible? Should they be data quality? How do we make sure that we document that? And a simple construct, an account, and its simplicity, you're saying that it's an account, but does it actually mean the same thing across all of us? And if you're going to talk about building a data product that needs to do hyper-personalization, how are we making sure that when we are referring to an active account, we are all using the same definition within the organization? So it goes back to how do we make sure from a data enablement or governance perspective is, are we making sure that we're making everybody data illiterate from a business perspective so that when we speak about it, we're all speaking the same language? How do we actually manage our data? From a data quality perspective, there's a lot of matrix that we need to enable, but there's the ownership perspective, there's different components. There's a business owner that needs to make decisions and be able to make decisions. There's a data steward that makes sure that they are applying the right things and the right rules. We are going to put this data in front of analysts, but where do they get those common definitions? How do they know the business rules that are applied when it comes to this data so that it's easy for them to actually use them? But also when there's data quality issues, it's always comfortable for me to know that there's somebody or there's a project that has been logged to actually make sure that we handle it. And within the banking ecosystem, I think we cannot run away from the fact that we do have a lot of legacy systems. We've got opportunities where new systems are being put in place, and when data teams are put into it, we can start making sure that the proper validations are put in place, and that from an upstream perspective, the data will be in the right format. However, because of legacy, we don't have the the same privilege to say that we'll go back and make those changes. That means a certain framework needs to be put in place so that the data can actually then be standardized so that we can do analysis on it. And that's just one on the data quality perspective. Then we start talking about how we're retaining data, how we're going to dispose of that data, because it's important that we follow those principles, right? And then there's the archiving component of it. Those from a data governance perspective, we start defining all of those things. We speak about privacy and security. It's important that we actually define those things. The product at the end is going to be used, but if the foundational blocks are not built up correctly, we're going to end up with models that are just not governed efficiently.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I mean, things around data governance and data enablement, it's a very good term. Metadata and lineage are core components of that nowadays. One of the things that we see is data scientists aren't aware of data or how to use data because they're not too sure where that data came from. They're not too sure where that data exists. They're not too sure what the authority of that data is. They're not too sure around the quality of that data. And so these are all critical conversations to enabling quicker turnaround times and return on investment when it comes to data science. So data enablement and data governance are incredibly important fields nowadays, and especially the data lifecycle. You mentioned retention and archiving. Those are also incredibly important, especially from a customer satisfaction perspective. Any customer nowadays can request, we want to see where our information is being used and how. And obviously, us as, for example, customers of insurance companies or whatever the case may be, we want to know how that information is being used. We want to know where it's being applied. And the only way that you can do that as an organization is through metadata management as well as lineage. And those are very critical data ownership principles that need to be managed as a data governance / enablement layer.
Yeah, and just as we close, I mean, you made that mentioned that word ownership, and then it brings us to that question, well, who owns the data? Yeah.
So, and I think that's the critical part, right? I usually say, like, let's take one domain, data ownership. So there's data ownership, there's data custodians. I don't think one person can ever own the data, but there are people that have got authority in terms of what those decisions are when it comes to that data. But holistically, yes, you would have with the person, but you need different players in order for this to actually work.
Do you have similar thoughts, Brad?
Yeah, no, agreed 100%. I think ownership as well is a very interesting debate. Like, as a data custodian or data owner, do I own the metadata? Because I obviously don't own a person's name. They are the owner of that data. And those play pivotal roles in the conversations that we have. And then also there's the conversations around data that's shared among multiple owners from a metadata perspective. We use, say, for example, a card number multiple times across the organization. Who owns that card number if it's used in 3 different places? So those start to also play a pivotal role in ownership and ensuring that there's accountability. And at the end of the day, it's all about accountability. If something were to go wrong, who is accountable from an organization perspective to ensure that the customer is, properly looked after.
And just to add on that ownership, because I think you're touching on an important one, because different domains can have shared ownership, and that's when you start making decision in terms of having to change or add critical data elements to that data. You actually need all those that share it to be in one room to make those decisions, because it's not a decision that one person can make. It's always easier if a data point is owned by one person because you go to one person. But to your point, not all data is equal. I think it's the point, though. Not all data is equal, and but from a data governance perspective, that's what it actually helps us to do, is understanding the value chain, who are the people that actually, the different stakeholders that play a part to it, and then we attribute it to make sure that whenever we're making decisions, all these players are there, just so that they are also included in the decision making.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. Thanks, Brad. I'm not sure, we've got 2 or 3 minutes. I'm not sure if there's a question from the audience. I'm going to stand so I can see. Anybody got a question for the 2 of them? No, there's always opportunities. There's a question in the back. I wonder if we can get a mic. Thanks, Ariel, just at the back there.
Hi. So my question is more on around AI. I know in the previous conversation there was that AI can only sort of be materialized if you move to the cloud. So now I've got a client who they can't move to the cloud. It doesn't help it that there was an issue with Microsoft a couple of weeks ago, but they want to start exploring this AI capability. Is it a far-fetched dream for them, or is it something that's possible? You know.
Okay, I'll take that one. So I think, there's an expression that goes, the cloud is just someone else's PC, right? At the end of the day, if you have the funding available, there is always a way to materialize a capability on-prem, whether that be a computer under a desk or something within a data center. The cloud opens up opportunities to services, so software as a service, which I'm sure everyone's aware with. Like, for example, if you're looking at AWS SageMaker, and it gives you instantaneous access to scalable resources as a hyperscaler. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't execute on-premise, right? I think, there are ways and means to access the processing power that's required on-premise. Again, if you have the resources available. People like, for example, universities have been utilizing GPU farms for decades now on-premise. So, there is definitely the opportunity to execute on-prem. It just means that you won't have access to potentially as scalable compute, as flexible compute, or as many services that are available on the cloud. So if it is use case specific and it is a niche use case, then sure, you can operate on-prem if you have the wherewithal. But at the same time, I think one of the critical things is skills required. If you're operating in an on-premise environment, there's a lot more skills that you are required to have access to, like, for example, networking engineers, database administrators, that you wouldn't necessarily need in the cloud as part of your rollout.
Thanks so much. Any other questions you have, you're welcome to connect. Let's grab it. If you can keep it nice and short, we can still fit it in. Please, that'll be great. Thanks.
Okay.
The mic's there for Marianne. Thank you.
So we've been talking about how important data is and the fact that it's an asset. And it's not just a realization that banks have, but also consumers. And we're seeing more and more consumers starting to revoke their consent around how their data is used. I'd love to get a perspective from you in terms of how banks are going to rethink the way that they innovate and provide, more innovative solutions when customers are becoming more and more educated around the use of their data.
Thank you.
So, and I think it's a good point, right? In terms of being also transparent, right? It's great that people they know actually in terms of what they can consent to or not. We were actually talking about it the other day that when just opening, from F&B, just opening my app, there's this little pop-up that comes in, and it's so funny how we are so quick also as customers just to click OK, and move on, and we don't know what is it that we're consenting to. But it's not just, it's with everything else. It's like we're so quick to consent to stuff. But to your point, in terms of how do we become innovative when customers decide to opt out, I think it's also important that we understand what is it that we are opting out to. There's certain contracts that when you're signing, is there's some sort of giving us the right in order for us to process your information to some extent, right? But where it becomes very important is that let us be transparent with you in terms of how we're going to use that data. Because in order for us to keep you as a customer, to give you the experience that you need, somehow we need to be able to tailor make it for you. But when we start doing other stuff that is outside and you're consenting out, that is also okay. However, I think the data sets that we also have, they're still very rich for us to actually do the analytics that we need.
Thanks much.
And one of the key components to any of these conversations that we have with customers is trust. The customer trusts us to utilize their data for purposes that are intended. And at the same time, we need to be respectful of that. And we can build trust and rapport with the customer. And in doing so, the customer will trust us to do more and more with their data, knowing that it benefits them. But at the end of the day, that's the bottom line, is that whatever we do needs to ensure that we benefit the customer.
Yeah, because it's a value, sorry, just to add, because it's a value conversation. So you're completely right. It's a value conversation, right? As if you're seeing value, you're most likely to want more as well. But if you don't see the value, but it's that constant collaboration between the bank and our customers just to make sure that the value is realized and the stuff that we can deliver for them.
Marianne, Kekana, thank you. Bradley Smith, appreciate your expertise and your time this morning. A round of applause for them, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much.